chocolate milk. All right, again, today we're talking about middle childhood, which is that sort of, again, the middle stage between your early childhood and adolescence when we start moving out of childhood and into adulthood. So that is what we are talking about today. Yeah, feel free to keep sharing your favorite fall things in the chat as we go too. Okay, so our agenda today, pretty simple, looking at physical development, cognitive development, and social development. We're probably going to look a lot more at cognitive and social development rather than physical because that's really when a lot more action is happening. There's a lot more brain activity going on in these later stages compared to physical activity. So we're going to be talking a lot more about how our brains develop and how our relationships with other people develop because we actually hit the stage where we can communicate with other people. So obviously our social development is going to be a lot bigger now in particular. Okay, so let's just talk about some little growth things during physical childhood. Our brains actually reach their adult size at around age 7. It doesn't mean they stop growing, it just means that size-wise they've hit that. Because our brains have grown so much, we become a lot better at planning and coordinating activity. Our prefrontal cortex, gosh, I really messed up that pronunciation, but that would be the part right in the very front of your brain, behind your eyes. It's the part of your brain that's responsible for decision making and critical thinking skills. So that section of your brain is going to mature a lot, and that allows kids in this stage of development to make better decisions than when they were younger. Increased myelination of neurons. So myelin is the sort of like fatty covering over our neurons that helps them send signals faster throughout our body. So because we have more myelin, our signals can move a lot faster, and that leads to both a quicker reaction time and also better memory. And we'll talk a little bit more about memory later on. During this stage, we may also see some growth spurts happening. Typically, kids, when they're not in a growth spurt, they'll grow about 5 to 7 pounds and about 2 inches every year. This stage, again, because our brains are developing so quickly, we see some really big increases in our motor skills. We talk a lot about gross and fine motor skills last week and the week before that. So remember, gross motor skills are our big movements, and then fine motor skills are our small, like fingers and hands, like the little precise movements that we have. Another thing we should keep in mind is that this is usually the stage when kids start getting really into sports. So physical activity goes up a lot, which is great in this stage because when we're growing at a steady rate, we'll want to have a lot of physical activity and make sure that we're staying really healthy. All right, next, nutrition in middle childhood. Now, because this is a time when our physical development is growing and we're growing really steadily at this stage, so it's not like a super fast rate, but we're going like very smooth and very steady in this phase of middle childhood. Because we're going so steadily, our nutrition and our eating habits are really important, and they're going to kind of set the stage for our nutrition habits later in life as well. So setting a bad habit now when it comes to our diets can have some pretty big consequences. Oh, you can see the last line. Can you see it now? Was it maybe just my screen that was doing something odd? I'm gonna hope you can, but I'm also gonna be talking through them all. And if you want to follow along on the slides, which I sent the link for a little bit earlier, you can take a peek on there too. All right, where was I? Oh, yes, nutrition. So does anyone remember talking about the food plate or the food pyramid when they were in elementary school?
They taught us that like in PE class.
Yeah, so they actually go over. So the reason why we actually go over the food plate and stuff in this stage of development, so like they usually start around like kindergarten and they'll continue it through like 3rd, 4th grade-ish, is because it's so important that we establish healthy eating habits right now in this stage of development. So that's actually why they talk about it in those earlier years of school. And you probably won't talk about it much in middle and high school because at that point it's kind of expected that you have those habits set up already. When psychologists and um, developmental scientists are talking to parents who have kids in these stage, they'll really emphasize the importance of giving like kids very nutrient dense food. So making sure they get all of their macronutrients, their micronutrients, their vitamins, their minerals, all that stuff. But at the same time, you shouldn't be overfeeding them and giving them too much food because that can also cause a problem. The two big barriers to like good nutrition in this stage is food insecurity, which is when households don't have easy, consistent access to healthy food. Um, because food insecurity is such a big problem and because it's so bad for kids, that's actually why a lot of public schools have um, free or reduced price lunches at school. So for kids that don't get their nutrients at home, they'll have a chance to at least get one nutritious, healthy meal at school. And then the other issue that we see is childhood obesity. So that's basically when, um, usually caused by some not good eating choices, eating really unhealthy, which may not be the fault of anyone. It could be a result of food insecurity, but it's when a kid is weighing heavier or they have a larger weight than what is considered healthy for um, their age group, their height, and stuff like that. That's so obesity can actually lead to cognitive impairments, which is why it's also so important that we try and reduce the amount of childhood obesity that we see in the world. But unfortunately, that's kind of on the rise right now. But um, childhood obesity has been shown to cause cognitive delays and cognitive defects in kids over time. So it's bad for a lot of reasons. Okay, now let's talk about physical health in middle childhood. So, exercise is one of the really big things in this stage. A lot of people see middle childhood as one of the best times to introduce a kid to a sport. Um, Sports are really beneficial for people of all ages, but in elementary school children, it's been shown to increase their quality of life, improve their physical and emotional development, and also improve their academic performance. So it's got a lot of benefits for kids in this stage. Um, Nearsightedness is the most common vision problem in middle childhood that we can find. Um, that would be when you can see objects that are close to you, but you can't see objects that are far away. Um, about I think one of the statistics I saw is about 1/4 of kids in this stage of development are going to get diagnosed with myopia and have to wear glasses, which is pretty high, and that number is actually going up. So we're trying to figure out why that is, and we're trying to find ways to um, help make sure kids don't start losing their vision so early on. Um, when it comes to our hearing, ear infections remain the like big common problem. They're a lot more common in early childhood compared to middle childhood, but it might still be an issue, especially if you're getting a lot of ear infections in a short amount of time, which can cause hearing loss. So we're still going to be keeping an eye on that during middle childhood. And then mental health is our other big one. Middle childhood is when you start losing your baby teeth and you have your permanent teeth growing in. So it's really important to make sure you're visiting the dentist on a regular basis, brushing your teeth twice a day, and flossing, and making sure that you don't ruin that brand new set of teeth, which you're going to have for life. Um, Again, this also ties back into our nutrition and healthy eating because, of course, eating foods that are pretty unhealthy can lead to problems with your teeth. Mental health is actually something that we should be monitoring during this stage. You might think of mental health as being something that comes up more when you're older, kind of in like adolescence and later stages of life, but certain mental health disorders can actually start rearing their head during middle childhood. So, um, we often watch to make sure kids aren't too stressed. Kids can actually develop anxiety, depression, and OCD, and all of those things can actually start coming up in middle childhood, which is why we should be keeping a very close eye on kids to make sure that we can get them the help they need as early as possible. All right, so moving on to cognitive development, I'm not going to spend too much more time on physical development since cognitive development is really where a lot of our stuff is going on. So going back to our good friend Jean Piaget with his wonderful theory of cognitive development. As I mentioned during week one, Piaget was probably one of the most notable scientists or psychologists of his time, and his theory of development is pretty big, and we kind of use it a bunch, especially for children. So you're going to hear Piaget come up a lot. You've already heard his name come up a bunch in our last couple of classes, but he's going to come up again this week, and he'll probably come up again next week too. So middle childhood lands in what Piaget called the concrete operational stage of development. If you remember last week, we talked about the pre-operational stage of development when kids are kind of, they haven't really developed the sense of logic just yet. So they're still kind of taking in the world with their sight and their senses and what they can see and touch. And they're a little bit more complex than a baby who can't really do very much with that information, but they're still not thinking logically in sort of like a mature way. The concrete operational stage marks the introduction of logic into our thinking. Wow, we can understand things at a deeper level. It's still pretty basic by adult standards, but they can do things a lot better than before. So they can solve problems a lot more systematically, and they have what we call organized and rational thinking. All right, so going into more depth on Piaget, he defined, I believe I think it's 7 different skills that kids are going to master during this stage of development. I probably should have bolded these so you can see them a little better, but that's on me. But the first one that we'll talk about is called seriation. Now, a lot of these words are going to seem really long, but the ideas behind them are pretty simple. So seriation is just the idea of being able to order things based on a characteristic. So if you give a kid a bunch of sticks of different sizes and you ask them to put them in order, they're going to have like a solid like plan of how they're going to organize these sticks. They're going to put the shortest one at the top and the longest one at the bottom, something like that, compared to when they were little and they kind of just organized it however they really wanted to. They didn't really have like a set planned method of doing that. Classification is the idea of being able to sort things based on one characteristic or more than one characteristic. I think last week I mentioned something about buttons, like different colored buttons. So like if so younger kids have a hard time sort of sorting things into different categories. They can only really see things as one category or another. But in the concrete operational stage, we can start seeing that we can start classifying things into different groups and like go into a lot more depth with how we classify them and look at different details at the same time. Reversibility, that's the idea that things that are changed can go back to their original state. So for example, if a kid is looking at an ice cube that melts into water, they can understand that you can freeze the ice cube again and turn it back into ice. If you can think of stuff like the commutative property of addition, 3 plus 2 is 5, and then 2 plus 3 is also 5. So you can flip those around and they're still the same. So this is the stage when kids can really start understanding that, which is pretty great when you're in school and you're trying to learn all of these new ideas in science and math. Conservation, that's another thing we talked about last week. That's the example with like the 2 different cups of different sizes. If you pour the water into another cup that's taller, kids are going to think that there's more water in that cup because the height of the water is higher. So conservation is that idea that just because you change one quality, it means that typically another quality is compensated for that. So just because the water in that glass looks like it's taller, the glass is like more narrow. So that's going to make it look like that. But kids in the concrete operational stage will understand now that there's the same amount of water in both. And then decentration kind of goes back up to classification. That's the idea that objects have more than one property. So we don't sort of focus specifically on one aspect of an object, like color. We can understand that objects have, they have a color, they have a shape, they have a size, and we can understand that all of those exist at the exact same time. So kids can go from only seeing things as red buttons or blue buttons. They can see things as big red buttons or small red buttons, and big blue buttons and small blue buttons. They can start sorting things into multiple categories at the same time. And then identity, an object's qualities don't change even if the object itself changes. So you remember when we were kids and we broke a crayon in half? How we understood that both of those are still the same crayon and we can use them both as crayons, even though it's technically broken. That's the idea of identity. We understand that this crayon is still a crayon, even though it's broken. A piece of chalk is still a piece of chalk, even if we break it in half. A pencil is still a pencil if we break it in half. An egg is still an egg, even if it's cracked on the floor. So that's the idea of identity. Even though objects look different, it doesn't mean that they are different things and that they like act differently. So a younger kid might see that broken crayon and think that they can't use it. But an older kid in this stage of development will understand that even though the crayon is broken, it's still a crayon and I can still use it to color. The last skill that Piaget identified is transitivity. So that's how objects will relate to one another. So the idea of, that's kind of like, if you think of it, like putting things into categories and then subcategories. So like, let me think of a good example. So let's think about mammals. So mammals are this group of organisms. We know what mammals are, sort of at least. And then within mammals, we have a category called dogs. So dogs are a kind of mammal. And then within dogs, we have golden retrievers, or a breed of dog. So we can understand that golden retrievers are a kind of dog, and dogs are a kind of mammal. Therefore, golden retrievers are a kind of mammal. So we understand that these categories fit into one another and that those different definitions relate to one another. That's the idea of transitivity. Does that all make sense? I know that's a lot to talk about on one slide. So does anyone have any questions so far that, or are they still curious about one of these? I'll just keep an eye on the chat. Feel free to just ask in the chat if you have a question and I can go over it again. If not, I'll move on. Okay, I'm going to assume that's no questions. Let me know if anything comes up later on and I'd be happy to jump back and explain it to you guys. I know this is a lot of big words that might not make a lot of sense, but yeah, so I just want to make sure that we're completely clear before I move on. Okay, so another psychologist that we're going to talk about today is Sternberg, and he came up with something that we call the triarchic theory of intelligence. So tri means three, and archic means sort of principles or ideas or institutions. So he decided, I think what he was doing is he was trying to pick students for a graduate program in psychology. And he was kind of annoyed that they were only looking at like their grades and their IQ and all that stuff to see like who would be in this special program, because he felt like people have different skill sets. So he decided to sort of do some research and classify intelligence into three different categories. So the first category that he described was analytical intelligence, also known as academic intelligence. So this is kind of what you think of as like the skills that you test when you're in school. So things like your ability to logically solve a problem, your verbal comprehension, like how you understand language, and um, spatial abilities, so how like you can imagine things, your visual understanding, and how you can see the world around you, as well as your vocabulary, of course, how many words you know, and your ability to use complex words. So that's kind of the idea that you could think of for like what we do in school, academic, what we do in an academic environment, the type of intelligence that we use. And then the next would be creative or experimental development. That's the ability to apply our skills to a new situation. So our ability to kind of adapt to a new environment and take what we have in our environment and, you know, understand like how we can use our knowledge and our academic intelligence and apply it to a real life scenario. And then the last type of intelligence that he identified was practical or contextual intelligence. And that's basically your ability to use common sense. So being able to solve a problem using basic principles that are ingrained in you, just kind of being able to do things and understand what's going on, just like based on how everyone else thinks of things, I suppose, using your common sense. I think that's a little bit common sense is kind of an easy term to understand. So I think that will hopefully make sense. And then next, the other theory we're going to talk about is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So this is kind of taking Sternberg's 3 types of intelligence and bringing it even further to 9 different kinds of intelligence. So Gardner was another psychologist. He was working at some random university, which I don't remember which one he was working at. But he was doing his research and he came to the conclusion that it would probably be evolutionary favorable for us. It would be good for us as humans to have different skill sets as different people. So let's keep accidentally clicking the slide. But what that means is that different people should have like different strengths, and having that variation in who has different strengths and different ideas would make us more likely to survive as a human race. And he also really wanted to prove that having a high IQ, having this really high like academic intelligence, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful in life. That IQ doesn't make up everything in the world. So he came up with these 9 different types of intelligence. So we can go through all of these one at a time. So the first 3 listed in this table are the ones that you could probably test with an IQ test. And then the next 3 are ones that are a lot less like easily defined by some test. So the first one is linguistic intelligence. So that's your ability to speak and write well. So someone with a really high linguistic intelligence would probably be very good at public speaking, very good at articulating their thoughts, and probably very good at like convincing people and like being very persuasive. Their ability to just speak and write and using that verbal method of communication is really strong. Next one would be your logical or mathematical intelligence. So that's your ability to use logic and your mathematical skills to solve problems. So, you know, if you're doing really well in math, that means that you have a really high mathematical or logical intelligence. Yeah, I think that one's probably pretty low for me. I'm not amazing at math. I can do math, but I'm probably not the best person at math. All right, and then our next one would be spatial intelligence. So that's our ability to think about objects in 3 dimensions. So sort of if you can like kind of like picture something in your head and understand like what it looks like, that would be your spatial intelligence, kind of your ability to visualize objects. So for some people, this is really, really strong for them. I'm a visual learner, so I really like spatial sorts of things. But I know for some people, it's really hard to kind of think of that stuff in your head. There's actually, I believe it's called aphantasia. where it's literally impossible for you to um, visualize things in your head. It's, I think, um, I wouldn't necessarily call it like a disorder, but it's just something that some people have. And then next is musical intelligence, which is probably pretty self-explanatory. It's your ability to perform or enjoy music. So people who are very good at music, if you have like perfect pitch or something like that, you probably have a really high musical intelligence where you're really able to get deep into that music and understand music very well. Um, Kinesthetic intelligence is our ability to move our body in sports or dance and other physical activities. So, for someone who's very athletic, someone who maybe does gymnastics or dance, you'll probably have a really high kinesthetic intelligence. You're very coordinated. You have a really good idea of where parts of your body are in space and relationship to you. So, you're very good at that. Interpersonal intelligence is our ability to understand and interact with others. So people who are, maybe very outgoing, very extroverted, they're very talkative, they communicate a lot with people, they would probably have a very high interpersonal attention or intelligence. Intrapersonal intelligence is the ability to have insight into yourself. So this might be more of something for those who are introverts, perhaps. So people who can, I swear, every time I click on the chat, it like messes with my screen share. So if I like flip between slides, it's probably why. Um, but yeah, so intrapersonal intelligence would be like you're very self-aware. You understand like who you are as a person, and what your skill set is, and how you process things, how you think about things, and that's probably something that'll definitely come with time. But you can definitely have a really strong interpersonal intelligence at a young age. Lily just said that she's probably not someone with high interpersonal intelligence. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that it's impossible when you're younger, but because your personality changes so much when you're younger, it's kind of hard to really know who you are as a person because you're always changing. But I definitely know some people that were very introspective. If your writing is bad, does that mean? So something that you should keep in mind is that no one is lacking in any of these kinds of intelligence. You have all of these different kinds of intelligence. It's just that you might have a higher level of one intelligence than another. So just because you're a bad writer doesn't mean that you have no linguistic intelligence. It just means that it might not be your highest type of intelligence. You might be more intelligent in another way. So that's kind of what makes this idea of intelligence really hard to define because everyone is different and everyone is good at different things. Everyone has a different type of intelligence that they're super high in. Okay, I think we were on naturalistic was my next one. So that would be the ability to, I guess, understand animals, plants, and other living things. So I suppose this one could be very good if you're interested in biology. Perhaps if you have like an affinity for the biological sciences, you might have some pretty high naturalistic intelligence. And then the last one is existential intelligence. So the ability to kind of look at life's bigger questions and kind of like that very wide unknown stuff, which would be like the meaning of life and like spirituality and like life after death and these really philosophical, hard to explain concepts. So if you're someone that really loves those types of things, then you're probably someone that might have some high existential intelligence. And again, this isn't to say that if you don't have any of these things, then you're not intelligent. It just means that you might have um, your intelligence or your talents might lie in another spot. And another big thing about all of these kinds of intelligence is that they aren't like static. Like you can improve your spatial and your musical and your kinesthetic intelligence. You can improve your impersonal intelligence. You could probably even improve your linguistic or logical intelligence as well. So none of these things are necessarily fixed. You can get better at all of these over time. Um, Making up the stories and writing them, then prettiness or cleanness of your writing. So I actually don't know. I feel like that might still kind of fall into linguistic intelligence. Like if you're able to like communicate well and you share your ideas in an effective way, that probably would count as linguistic intelligence too. But moving on, next we're going to talk about cognitive processes. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, middle childhood is a pretty big stage for our cognitive development. Our brains grow a bunch. You know, we've hit our adult-sized brains, which is pretty awesome. So we're going to be doing a bunch of really cool new stuff now. So these are just a couple of things that start to develop cognitively in this stage of childhood. So the first thing is our working memory. So our ability to like our working memory is kind of like our ability to remember stuff as we go and kind of recall it quickly before it gets stored into our long-term memory. So our working memory becomes a lot more efficient in this stage. That's mainly because our brain becomes um, a lot quicker at processing information, and it also gets a lot better at filtering unnecessary information out. So our brains just become more efficient overall, and they can really like understand like what about like what's going on right now is really important that I need to keep, and what about it do I not need, do I need to get rid of. So because our brain gets really good at filtering all of that, our memory becomes, it's a lot easier for us to form memories because our brain doesn't have to do as much work, if that makes sense. In that same vein, our attention span becomes a lot better because of that brain filter. You know, we're not focusing on so many things all at once. Our brain is able to get very specific on a certain task. So we're able to focus on something a lot better, and we're able to take a more strategic approach to solving problems. Um, During the stage, kids will often use like more memory strategies. Like you can think of Roy G. Biv to remember the colors of the rainbow in order. Those different like little tricks and mnemonics to remember different ideas and things. Those become a lot more commonly used in middle childhood, probably because our working memory is increasing and we can actually use those patterns and think about them a little bit more. Our knowledge base, which is basically just the knowledge that we have so that we can get new knowledge. So, like our baseline of knowledge, that grows significantly in middle childhood. So, we learn a lot more, which helps us to learn a lot more in the future. Next is metacognition. So, metacognition, if you've heard of like something being meta, that's kind of like what this is. So this is the idea that we are aware of our own thoughts. So we can think about how we think, if that makes sense. So we understand how our brains work in a way, and we can use that knowledge to help us like recognize like when we have a limit, like when we can't do something, and it can help us prioritize like what tasks are more important than other tasks. So we become a lot better at that. So that's metacognition for you. And then the last thing I'll talk about is critical thinking. So if you think about the stage, kids are always asking why. And the reason why they're always asking why is because their critical thinking skills are improving. They're a lot better at evaluating the information that they receive and using that information to make decisions. So they're going to be asking, you know, why everything is as it is because they want to get better at that critical thinking. Right, language development. So I know I mentioned that cognitive development was going to take a while. So here we are. We're still in cognitive development right now. So during middle childhood, kids start to understand that there are a lot of different aspects to language. So, you know, there's the vocabulary, there's grammar, there's pronunciation. I believe I have this little thing right here. This is a diagram that people use in linguistics. So these are kind of like how we classify language. So we start understanding that there are all of these different levels to language and how language works. So additionally, during this stage, oh my gosh, right, there we go. Our vocabulary increases to about 40,000 words, which is a lot of words, but they're all words that we need. We become a lot better at understanding the context behind a situation and also like figures of speech and expressions. So we start taking things a lot less literally. That was something really big in early childhood. We took things like pretty literally. We didn't really understand um like sarcasm and stuff like that. Like during early childhood, we don't really understand that like sometimes in different contexts, a different word can have a different meaning. But in middle childhood, in this sort of elementary school age, we start getting a lot better at doing that. Another thing to note is that bilingual children are actually proven to have a cognitive advantage. So, if you're a kid who's growing up learning more than one language, your brain actually is wired differently. It makes you, it kind of like increases the connections that your brain has between different parts of your brain. And it also actually allows your brain to learn a third or a fourth language a lot quicker. So if you're someone that grew up learning multiple languages or speaking multiple languages, then um, congrats, you actually have a cognitive advantage. Your brain is actually working differently compared to people who only know one. So good for you. Uh, Big thing here is that learning to read is a really big thing going on in this stage. We're in elementary school, we're really starting to learn how to read written language. Um, that's another reason why we start to understand those different aspects of the language. We're exposed to a lot more language. Now it's not just the language that we hear and the language that we use to speak, it's the language that we use to read and write. So our language development grows in different ways than before. Of course, because we're doing all of this development, it's also when we have disorders begin to come up. So, learning, speech, and language disorders are pretty much detected during middle childhood. So, the first four I have here dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and dysgraphia are basically just different like difficulties that we have. So dyslexia is an issue with words and letters, where you have a hard time sort of like reading words and letters and kind of understanding them. Dyscalculia is the same thing except with math and numbers. Um, right. So Eleanor just asked a question. When you hear a new, totally new language, um, how did you learn English and French? Are we born like that? Okay, so something big that you should keep in mind is that when we're babies, our brains are hardwired to listen for sounds in any language. So when we're babies, we can like recognize like language sounds that appear in like universally in all languages. So even though like English and Italian or Hindi or Russian, they all have like very different sounds to them. When we're babies, we can understand all of those sounds. But once we get into like toddlerhood and early development, um, that's when, based on what language you're listening to a bunch at home, that's the language that we're going to start being able to hear exclusively. So by around like age 1 or age 2, when we start speaking for the first time, that's when we've stopped being able to hear all those languages. Have our brains like once they never get like an opportunity to hear those words and those sounds consistently, so they're just going to get rid of it so that our brains can work more efficiently. But yeah, so when we're little, we're very good at absorbing new languages, and as we age, it gets a lot harder to learn a new language. Hope that answered your question. Okay, I was talking about disorders. Yes, dyspraxia is the same thing, but with uh, speech, I believe. So dyspraxia would be when you're having a hard time sort of understanding speech and communicating. And then dysgraphia is, shoot, I'm blanking. Uh, so dysgraphia would be, oh gosh, I literally just can't remember. So dyslexia is words, dyscalculia is math, dyspraxia would be like spoken language and speaking, and then um, dysgraphia. I'm thinking that might be like, so that one is writing. So dyslexia is reading and dysgraphia is writing. Okay, I got it eventually. Auditory and visual processing disorders, that's pretty much when your eyes and your ears are working just fine, but the signals that are getting sent to your brain get a little bit muddled up. So if you have an auditory processing disorder, you might be hearing something, but you're having a hard time understanding it. And same thing with visual. If you can see everything just fine, but you aren't really like recognizing it for what it is. Aphasia is something that is actually going on in our language section of our brain. So that would be like a loss of language, essentially. So this could be either we aren't understanding the language that we're hearing, or we're trying to speak, and it for us it sounds like we're saying things the right way, when in reality, what we're saying out loud sounds like absolute gibberish. It's a really interesting disorder, and you'll see it a lot more in older people, but it's possible that younger kids could experience it too, just depending on how our brains are wired. Fluency disorders would be, that would make sense. You're having a hard time like reading language smoothly and fluently or speaking fluently. Articulation disorders would be like having a hard time pronouncing certain things. So maybe if you had a lisp growing up and you weren't able to pronounce certain sounds, that would be an articulation disorder. And then a voice disorder could be something like maybe having a hard time like speaking like clearly, speaking at the right volume. Maybe you have a hard time speaking at all. Like something that could happen is you could be selectively mute, where sometimes the words just don't come out. You're unable to vocalize your thoughts. Um, Basically, any like disorder where the your voice itself is hard to understand, like consistently. Okay, there's cognitive development. We have a little bit of time left, and we're going to talk about social development. So Erik Erikson was a big person when it came to social development, just like Piaget was for cognitive. So Erik Erikson, he was the one who kind of gave us stages for every time in our lives, rather than just looking at childhood. So middle childhood lands in Erikson's stage of what we call industry versus inferiority. So this stage is all about like comparing yourself to your peers. It's really active when it comes to our social development. Um, the big thing here is that we're very industrious. We're going to be doing a lot. So we're like going to be doing a lot of work. We're going to be very productive. And when we're able to do things successfully, it leads to confidence. But when we do things unsuccessfully, or we aren't able to do something successfully, we have this sense of inferiority. We feel like we're not good enough, or we're not as good as everyone else. And then another thing that starts coming up in this stage in particular is Kohlberg, and he wanted to see how our sense of right versus wrong, our morality, changes over time. And he has these 6 stages that he uses in like sort of like early childhood, middle childhood to adolescence and adulthood. So that's kind of where the morality stages start. Before that time, kids don't really have a sense of right and wrong that we can measure and understand completely. They probably do have an innate sense of right or wrong, but it's hard to really understand how that affects them like socially, because babies don't really have a social life. They're just too self-absorbed to think about other people. But I have this table right here that goes over the different stages. So the first 2 stages fall in what we call pre-conventional morality. So in this stage, we're really looking at like, we're very like, self-interest is the big thing. So we don't do things because we don't want to get punished for them. And then stage 2 is when we go from just looking at punishment to looking at rewards. So we're going to do something because we get a reward from it, or we're not going to do something because there's a reward from it. So that's pre-conventional morality. So this would be like early childhood, I suppose. Perhaps a little bit of middle childhood as well. Conventional morality is the stages that we go into during later middle childhood and adolescence, and a lot of adults. So this would be the goal for this is we make decisions based on wanting to be accepted by society as a whole. So we're going to do things because they are good, because society approves of them. And we're going to not do things that are bad because they're against what we see as right and wrong as a big group of humans. So stage 3 is going to be looking at how our actions impact other people and the importance of like being accepted by a community. And then stage 4 is going to be based on like laws or rules in the world. So like the example that they're doing here is, I think, stealing something. So in stage 4, the reason why we wouldn't steal something is because it's against the law. And then post-conventional morality is sort of like this highest stage of moral understanding. So there's like the abstract reasoning behind it, so we can understand the different sides of a situation. So stage 5 would be like really like abstract reasoning, like again, understanding that there's more than one perspective on things. So in this case, the person says, so the person we should steal the drug in this case because we have to consider the whole situation and that we can't just use the law to say things, because sometimes laws can be unfair. And then our final stage is based on ethics, essentially. So principles of ethics and morality that we decide. So maybe the person prioritizes something over property, so that's why they're going to steal it. So that's really like the highest stage of moral intelligence. And not everyone reaches that stage. Okay, I think this is my last slide. So the last thing we're going to talk about is self-understanding when it comes to social development. So I mentioned last week that younger kids have a really big sense of self. You know, they want to be the biggest, the best, the coolest. They want to be that superlative. So once we get to middle childhood, we get a lot more realistic. We understand that we're not going to be the best at everything. We don't necessarily aim to be like seen as the best at everything. We understand that we have our flaws and we have our strengths, and we don't have to be good at everything. We don't have to be most important all the time. Self-efficacy is this sense of knowing whether or not you can do something. So that's another thing that really starts to develop in this stage, again, because kids are, yes, it is normal that you learned about ethics in a religious course. Religion is pretty big on that ethics and that idea of right or wrong. Shoot. Okay. To continue, so self-efficacy is, again, this idea of like knowing if you can or can't do something. So again, because we are a lot more self-aware of our limits, and we have that skill of metacognition, like I mentioned earlier, we can understand this a lot better. So we have motivations. We start having like a motivation to do things rather than just meeting our basic needs. So we can have external motivations, like perhaps like a positive like thing. So like if you do something good, then you'll get a reward. And if you do something bad, then this is going to happen. So we won't do this thing. And then we'll also have internal motivations. So maybe kids in this stage might choose to help a friend who got hurt because helping a friend makes them feel happy. And then another thing that relates to this is what we call learned helplessness. So a low self-efficacy can make kids think that they can never master something. They feel like they're not good at anything. So it kind of plays into that self-esteem, mental health thing that we're always monitoring. So if a kid has like a low self-efficacy, it can lead to mental health problems and a low self-esteem and feeling like that, which isn't good. So it's very important that kids understand that they can do things, and even if they have a hard time with it at first, that doesn't mean that they're never going to be good at it. The last thing, family atmosphere also plays a really big role in all stages of child development, but particularly in this stage through this idea of, again, stress. Stress is pretty big in this stage. So if your home life is really unstable, maybe there's a divorce or a death in the family, or parenting is just not great in general. Maybe the kid is getting neglected during this stage, or they aren't getting their needs met consistently. That can give kids a lot of stress, and that does actually affect their development overall. So in early stages of development, it like significantly affected their cognitive development. So kids who don't get proper care when they're really little have a bunch of problems growing up, because having that parental care and that attachment is really important for language development and all sorts of things, because we learn by watching other people. Now, in this stage, we've kind of hit that, we've watched other people, we have our foundation set up. So now it really comes down to like our emotions and how we feel and our mental health and our confidence and stuff like that. So family atmosphere begins to affect that a lot more compared to like our cognitive development and our stages there. Okay, recap really quick. Today we talked about middle childhood. We talked about growth, nutrition, and physical health for our physical development aspect. We talked about cognitive development, looking at Piaget, Sternberg, and Gardner. Sternberg and Gardner were looking at different types of intelligence. We looked at different cognitive processes that develop during middle childhood. That's things like metacognition, we have an improved working memory, stuff like that. We went over language development, how kids develop language, they start understanding language a lot better. And then we looked at social development. We looked at Erickson and how he classified it, and we looked at Kohlberg and his model for moral development. And then last, we talked about self-understanding and self-efficacy. That was what we just talked about. So that is middle child.